The bullet tore through the morning before John Marston could even draw breath. He didn't think. There wasn't time for thinking. One moment he was standing in the dirt road outside Miller's general store, adjusting the saddle on his horse, and the next he was throwing his body sideways, hard and reckless, between the widow and the rifle's aim. The impact hit him like a hammer to the shoulder, spinning him backward into the dust. The sky above turned white with pain. Then there was silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that comes after violence, when the world holds its breath and waits to see who's still standing. John lay on his back, staring up at the pale blue sky, feeling the warm spread of blood beneath his shirt. His shoulder burned. His ears rang. Somewhere far away, a horse whinnied. Boots scraped against dirt. And then a woman's face appeared above him, young, pale, with dark hair falling loose from its pins and eyes that held more fear than he'd ever seen in one person. "Don't move," she whispered. Her hands were on him, pressing hard against his shoulder, and he could feel her shaking. "Please don't move." He tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't work right. The pain was spreading now, crawling down his arm like fire. He'd been shot before, twice in fact, but this one felt different. Maybe because he hadn't been ready for it. Maybe because he didn't know why it had happened. The woman, Anna Hayes, he remembered now, the widow who'd arrived in town 3 weeks ago with a boy and nothing else, was crying. Not loudly, just silent tears that rolled down her cheeks and fell onto his shirt, mixing with the blood. Her lips were moving, forming words he couldn't quite hear. Prayers, maybe, or apologies. "Ma'am," he managed, his voice rough and broken. "You're safe." She nodded, but her expression said otherwise. John turned his head slightly, wincing at the movement, and saw the gunman. A stranger, dressed in black, standing 30 feet away with his rifle still raised. The man's face was hard and empty, the face of someone who'd killed before and would kill again without losing sleep over it. But he wasn't shooting. He was just standing there, watching, as if waiting for something. "That's enough for now," the gunman called out. His voice carried across the empty street like a stone dropped in still water. "Just wanted to send a message, Mrs. Hayes. Just wanted you to know we're still looking." Then he turned and walked away, climbing onto his horse with slow, deliberate movements. No one in town moved to stop him. No one even came outside. John could see faces in windows, people watching from behind curtains and half-closed doors, but no one stepped forward. Fear had that effect. It turned whole towns into ghosts. The gunman rode off toward the west, disappearing into the heat shimmer that made the horizon look like water. Anna Hayes was still pressing her hands against John's shoulder, still crying those silent tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. You don't even know me." "Don't matter," John said through gritted teeth. The pain was settling now, becoming something he could live with, at least for the moment. Couldn't just stand there. "You should have." Her voice cracked. "You should have let him shoot me." John looked up at her properly, then really looked at her, and saw something in her face that went deeper than fear. Exhaustion. The kind that comes from running too long, without rest. The kind that makes a person wish, sometimes, that the running would just end. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have." By the time Doc Harrison arrived, summoned by someone brave enough to run for help, John had been moved into the shade beside the general store. Anna had torn strips from her petticoat to press against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. Her hands were stained red. Her dress was ruined. But she hadn't left his side. The doctor worked quickly, his weathered hands steady and sure. He'd spent 40 years patching up cowboys, ranchers, and the occasional outlaw on this frontier, and he'd seen worse than a shoulder wound. Still, he wasn't gentle about it. "Bullet went clean through," Doc Harrison muttered, probing the wound with fingers that smelled like whiskey and tobacco. "You're lucky, Marston. Few inches lower, and you'd be meeting your maker right about now." John didn't feel lucky. He felt like he'd been kicked by a mule. "Who was he?" the doctor asked, glancing at Anna. "The shooter." Anna's face went even paler. "I don't know his name, but I know who sent him." She didn't say more than that, and Doc Harrison didn't push. In the West, A person's past was their own business until they chose to share it. That was the unspoken law of the frontier. You didn't ask questions unless you were ready to hear answers that might change everything. John studied the widow while the doctor wrapped his shoulder in clean bandages. She was younger than he'd thought at first, maybe 25, maybe less. Her dress was simple and worn, the kind poor folks wore when they were trying to look respectable, but didn't have the money for anything fine. Her hands were rough, calloused from work. But it was her eyes that caught him. Dark eyes that had seen too much too soon, eyes that carried stories she'd probably never tell. "You got somewhere to stay?" John asked after the doctor had finished and packed up his bag. Anna hesitated. "The boarding house. For now." "That won't be safe." The words came out before John could stop them. "If they know you're in town, they'll come back. Maybe at night. Maybe when there's no one around to see." "I know." Her voice was barely a whisper. John should have left it there. Should have wished her well, climbed on his horse, and ridden back to his ranch to heal in peace. He had cattle to tend, fences to mend, and a whole life that didn't include getting shot for strangers. But something in her expression stopped him, something broken and brave at the same time. "I got a place," he heard himself say. "Ranch about 6 miles north of here. Got extra rooms. It ain't much, but it's far enough from town that you'd see someone coming from a long way off." Anna stared at him. "I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask. I'm offering. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, or who's after me, or what they'll do to anyone who helps me." Her voice broke. "You took a bullet for me, already. That's more than I deserve." John pushed himself up to sitting, ignoring the pain that shot through his shoulder. "Ma'am, I don't know your story. Don't know what trouble you're running from. But I know one thing. That man who shot me, he wasn't trying to kill you. Not today. He was trying to scare you. Which means whatever you got that they want, they need you alive to get it." Anna's expression changed. Just for a moment, something like hope flickered across her face before the fear swallowed it again. "There's a boy," she said quietly. "My son. He's at the boarding house. Bring him." "Mr. Marston, John," he corrected. "And I ain't changing my mind. You need a place to stay, and I got one. Simple as that." It wasn't simple, of course. Nothing ever was. But as John watched Anna Hayes gather what little courage she had left and gnawed her acceptance, he felt something shift inside him. Something that had been sleeping for a long time, maybe since his own wife had left him 2 years ago, taking their daughter and whatever future he'd imagined with her. The ranch house was too big for one man, too quiet, too full of memories that didn't keep him warm at night. Maybe it was time for something different. Maybe it was time to stop running from his own ghosts and help someone else outrun theirs. As Anna helped him to his feet and they began the slow walk toward where his horse waited, John caught sight of a small face in the boarding house window up the street. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, watching them with eyes that looked far too old for his age. The child didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched with the stillness of someone who'd learned that movement draws attention, and attention brings danger. John nodded toward the window, a small gesture of acknowledgement. The boy disappeared into the shadows, and John Marston understood in that moment that he'd just stepped into something much bigger than a simple act of kindness. He'd stepped into a story already in motion, a story written in blood and secrets and the kind of desperation that makes people do terrible things. But he'd made his choice when he threw himself in front of that bullet. Now he'd see it through to whatever end waited at the road's end. The boy hadn't spoken in 6 months. Anna told him this on the wagon ride to the ranch, her voice quiet beneath the creak of wheels and the steady clop of horse hooves on packed dirt. Samuel sat between them, small and still, his hands folded in his lap like he was afraid to take up too much space in the world. The child's eyes were fixed on the horizon, watching the scrub brush and red dust roll past, but John could tell he wasn't really seeing any of it. "He used to talk all the time," Anna said, not looking at John, but at her son. "Used to ask questions about everything. Why the sky was blue, where the birds went at night, whether God could hear you if you whispered." She paused, swallowing hard. Then one night, men came to our house. And, after that, nothing. John didn't ask what the men had done. The answer was written in the way Samuel flinched whenever a door closed too hard, in the way his small body went rigid at the sound of approaching footsteps. Some stories didn't need words. The ranch appeared over the ridge just as the sun began its descent toward evening. John's property stretched across 200 acres of rough grassland, bordered by low hills and a creek that ran clear most of the year. The house itself was simple, rough-cut timber and stone, with a wide porch and shutters that needed painting. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop, and corrals that held more emptiness than livestock these days. It had been a family home once. Now it was just a place where a man slept between long days of work that never seemed to end. Anna climbed down from the wagon slowly, her movements careful, like someone who'd learned to expect pain from sudden gestures. She lifted Samuel down after her, and the boy stood close to her skirts, one small hand twisted in the fabric. His eyes scanned the ranch with the wariness of a wild animal checking for predators. "It ain't much," John said, his shoulder throbbing as he tied off the horse. "But it's solid. And it's far enough from town that you'll hear anyone coming along before they arrive." "It's more than we deserve," Anna whispered. John wanted to tell her that wasn't true, but he didn't know her story yet. Didn't know if she was running from justice or from injustice. Didn't know if her husband had been a good man or a fool or something worse. All he knew was that she had a child who'd forgotten how to speak, and that seemed like punishment enough for whatever sins she might be carrying. Inside, the house was clean but cold. Empty rooms that echoed with footsteps. Furniture covered in dust cloths, like ghosts waiting to be remembered. John showed them to the bedroom at the end of the hall, his daughter's room, before his wife had taken her east to live with her sister. The bed was small but sturdy, the quilt still folded at its foot, stitched with yellow flowers that his wife had spent a winter creating. "You and the boy can stay here," John said, standing in the doorway. "I'll be just across the hall if you need anything." Anna turned to face him, and in the fading light through the window, she looked even younger than before. Younger and more tired, like someone who'd been running uphill for so long she'd forgotten what level ground felt like. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." John leaned against the doorframe, trying to ease the weight off his injured shoulder. "Maybe I'm just tired of eating supper alone." It was meant to be light, but the truth in it hung heavy between them. That night, after he'd made a simple meal of beans and cornbread, they sat at the kitchen table in silence. Samuel hadn't touched his food. He just sat there, staring at his plate, his small fingers tracing patterns in the wood grain. Anna tried to coax him to eat, her voice soft and pleading, but the boy didn't respond. John watched them across the table and felt something tighten in his chest. His own daughter had been like this once, quiet, afraid, after a rattlesnake had bitten her when she was 5. She'd survived, but for weeks afterward she'd barely spoken, as if words had become too dangerous to trust. He'd known how to reach her then. Patience. Presence. Not pushing, just being there until she remembered it was safe to speak again. But this boy's silence was different, deeper, the kind that comes from seeing something no child should ever witness. "Samuel," John said quietly, and the boy's eyes flickered toward him for just a moment. "You like horses?" No response. But something changed in the child's expression, the smallest shift, like a door opening, just a crack. "Got a mare in the barn," John continued, keeping his voice easy and slow. "Name's Willow. She's gentle. Good with kids. Maybe tomorrow, if you want, you could help me brush her down. She'd like that." Samuel's gaze dropped back to his plate, but his fingers had stopped tracing patterns. He was listening. Anna's eyes met John's across the table, and in them he saw gratitude mixed with something that looked like grief. Like she'd forgotten what kindness looked like until it appeared in front of her. After supper, while Anna put Samuel to bed, John sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. His shoulder ached. The bandage needed changing, but he didn't move. Just sat there, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, crickets and wind, and the distant call of a coyote somewhere in the hills. He heard the door open behind him, heard Anna's soft footsteps on the wooden boards. "He's asleep," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "First time in weeks, he hasn't cried himself to sleep." John nodded, but said nothing. For a long time they sat in silence, two people who'd become strangers to peace, trying to remember what it felt like. Then Anna spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband's name was Thomas Hayes. He worked as a clerk for a mining company up in Colorado. Good job. Decent pay. We had a little house, nothing fancy, but it was ours." She paused, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "Then he got greedy. Started skimming money from the company accounts. Not much at first, just a little here and there. He said he was doing it for us, so we could have a better life. So Samuel could have opportunities." John listened, his eyes on the stars. "But the men who owned that mine," Anna continued, "they weren't the forgiving type. When they found out what Thomas had done, they came to our house. Samuel was supposed to be asleep, but he'd gotten up for water. He saw everything." Her voice cracked. "They beat Thomas to death right there in our kitchen. Made me watch. Told me they'd do the same to Samuel and me if we didn't tell them where he'd hidden the money." "Did you tell them?" "I didn't know. Thomas never told me. He just kept saying he'd put it somewhere safe, somewhere they'd never find it. But he died before he could say where." Anna wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Those men, they didn't believe me. They tore apart our house looking for it. Then they said they'd give me time to remember, time to think about whether I loved my son enough to tell the truth. They've been following us ever since. Watching. Waiting." John finally turned to look at her. In the moonlight, she looked like a ghost herself, pale and fragile, like she might disappear if the wind blew too hard. "How much did he take?" $15,000. John let out a low whistle. That was more money than most ranchers saw in a lifetime. Enough to kill for. Enough to die for. "And you really don't know where it is?" "I swear on my son's life, I don't know." Her voice was fierce now, desperate. "If I knew, I'd give it to them. I'd give them anything to make this stop. But Thomas died with that secret, and now Samuel and I are paying for it." John leaned back in his chair, thinking. The smart thing would be to send them away in the morning, to wish them well and close his door on their trouble before it became his trouble too. He'd already taken a bullet for this woman. He didn't owe her his life. But then he thought about the boy, Samuel, with his silent grief and his two old eyes. He thought about the way the child had looked at him during supper, that small flicker of something that might have been hope. "They'll come here eventually," John said. "Once they figure out where you are." "I know. Could be dangerous. For all of us." "I know," Anna repeated, her voice breaking. "That's why we should leave. Tomorrow. Before we bring any more trouble to your door." John was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No," he said simply. "You'll stay." Anna stared at him. "Mr. Marston, John," he corrected again. "And you'll stay because that boy needs a place where he can remember what safe feels like. You both do. Whatever comes, we'll face it when it gets here." "Why?" The question came out as barely more than a breath. "Why would you risk everything for people you don't even know?" John thought about his own daughter hundreds of miles away, living a life he wasn't part of anymore. He thought about the empty rooms in his house and the silence that had become his only companion. He thought about all the things he'd failed to protect, all the moments he'd let slip away because he was too proud or too afraid or too broken to hold on. "Because," he said quietly, "sometimes a man gets a second chance to do right. And if he's smart, he doesn't waste it." The next morning, Samuel came to the barn. John was mucking out stalls when he heard the soft scuff of small feet on dirt. He turned and saw the boy standing in the doorway, backlit by early sun, his thin frame casting a long shadow across the hay-strewn floor. "Morning," John said, keeping his voice easy. He went back to his work, not staring, giving the child space to decide whether to come closer or run. For a long time, Samuel just stood there, watching, weighing. Then, slowly, he walked forward until he stood beside the stall where Willow waited, her brown eyes soft and patient. "This here's Willow," John said, reaching up to stroke the mare's nose. "Like I said, she's gentle. You can touch her if you want. She won't bite." Samuel lifted one small hand, hesitating, then placed it carefully on the horse's neck. Willow nickered softly, turning her head to nuzzle the boy's shoulder, and something broke across Samuel's face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of what a smile might become. John handed the boy a brush. "She likes when you go with the grain, nice and slow. Like this." He demonstrated, and Samuel copied the movement, his small hands working the brush through Willow's coat with careful attention. They worked in silence, man and boy, with only the sound of bristles on horsehair and the mare's contented breathing filling the space between them. And then Samuel reached out and took John's hand. Just like that. No warning. No words. Just a small hand slipping into a larger one, trusting and warm. John felt his throat tighten, felt something crack open in his chest, something he thought had calcified beyond repair. He looked down at the boy, at Samuel's face turned up toward his, and saw in those dark eyes not just fear and grief, but something else. The beginning of hope. The possibility that maybe, somewhere in all this pain and loss and running, there was still a chance for something good to take root. John squeezed the boy's hand gently, just once, then released it so Samuel could keep brushing. But the warmth of that small hand stayed with him long after the boy had finished and returned to the house, stayed with him like a brand or a promise, or a prayer he didn't know he'd been holding in his heart. And John understood then that this wasn't temporary, that somehow, without meaning to, he'd just become responsible for two lives that weren't his own, that the road ahead would be harder than he'd imagined, and the cost might be more than he could afford to pay. But he also understood something else, that a man's life wasn't measured by what he kept, but by what he was willing to give away when it mattered most. The dust came first, 3 columns of it, rising against the orange sky like smoke from distant fires. John saw them from the corral where he was mending fence wire, his hands stilling on the wood as he watched the riders approach. He didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. Didn't need to hear their voices to understand why they'd come. He'd known this moment would arrive eventually, had felt it coming like a storm building on the horizon, heavy and inevitable. "Anna," he called toward the house, keeping his voice level. "Get Samuel. Get inside. Now." She appeared in the doorway, a dish towel in her hands, her face going pale as she followed his gaze to the approaching riders. She didn't ask questions, just turned and disappeared into the house, and John heard her footsteps quick on the wooden floor, heard her urgent whisper calling for her son. John walked to the porch and lifted his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. The Winchester was old but reliable, cleaned and oiled just yesterday, like he cleaned it every week, more from habit than necessity. His shoulders still ached from the bullet wound, but his hands were steady as he checked the chamber. The 3 riders came to a stop 30 yards from the house, their horses stamping and blowing in the evening heat. The man in the center was the same one who'd shot John in town, tall and lean, dressed in black, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the weather too long. The 2 men flanking him were younger, meaner, with the kind of eyes that enjoyed causing pain. Marston, the man in black, called out. His voice was flat, empty of everything except cold purpose. "We've come for the widow, and whatever information she's got about our money." John stood on his porch, the rifle held loose across his chest, and said nothing. "You got no stake in this, rancher," the man continued. "This is between us and her. Between us and what her dead husband stole. You step aside now, we'll forget you ever got involved." "Can't do that," John said quietly. The man's eyes narrowed. "You already took a bullet for her once. You looking to take more? If that's what it takes." One of the younger gunmen laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're a fool, old man. There's 3 of us and 1 of you, and that woman ain't worth dying for." "That's where you're wrong," John said, and meant it. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, his leather creaking. "We know she's in there. We know she's been here for weeks. Now you can hand her over peaceful, or we can come in and get her ourselves. Either way, we're leaving here with what we came for." "No," John said. "You're not." The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. The three men exchanged glances, and John saw them calculating, weighing the odds, measuring his resolve, deciding whether he was bluffing or if he really meant to stand against them. He kept his face calm, his breathing steady, even though his heart was hammering against his ribs. He'd been in situations like this before, back when he was younger and the frontier was wilder. Back before he'd settled down and tried to build something permanent. He knew how these things ended. Knew that words only went so far before leads started flying. Behind him, he heard the door open. "John, don't," Anna's voice came, thick with fear. "Please. Just let them take me. I'm not worth your life. Get back inside," John said, without turning around. "Listen to her, Marston," the leader called. "Woman's got sense. Even if you don't." But Anna didn't go inside. Instead, John heard her footsteps on the porch boards, felt her presence beside him. When he glanced sideways, he saw she was holding his old Colt revolver, the one he kept in the kitchen drawer. Her hands were shaking, but she held it pointed toward the riders. "I won't let anyone else die because of me," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling. "Not you. Not Samuel. If they want me, they can have me. But they have to promise to leave the boy alone." "Anna," John started. "Promise," she shouted at the men, and there was something fierce in her voice now, something that came from the deepest place a mother's love can reach. "Promise me you'll leave my son out of this." The leader smiled, and it was the cruelest thing John had ever seen. "Can't make promises I don't intend to keep, ma'am. That boy's leverage. Insurance, in case you still think you can lie to us about where that money's hidden." Anna's face crumpled. The gun wavered in her hands. And then the door opened again, and Samuel stepped out onto the porch. The boy was small against the evening light, thin and fragile looking, but there was something different about him now. Something John hadn't seen before. Samuel walked forward, past his mother, past John, and stood at the edge of the porch steps. For 6 months, this child had been silent. For 6 months, he'd carried his grief and fear like stones in his pockets, weighing him down until he could barely stand. But now, standing before the men who'd murdered his father, something inside him finally broke open. "No," Samuel said. The word came out small and cracked, like something that had been buried, and was just now clawing its way back to the surface. But it was a word. The first word he'd spoken since that terrible night in Colorado. Everyone froze. "No," Samuel said again, louder this time. His small hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his whole body trembling. "You can't have her. You can't have us." The leader's smile faded. "Boy, you don't know what you're saying. Now get back inside before—" "He's my father now," Samuel interrupted, pointing at John. His voice was gaining strength, growing steadier with each word, like a muscle remembering how to work. "He protects us. He keeps us safe. And you can't take that away. You already took everything else, but you can't have this." John felt something crack inside his chest, something warm and painful and beautiful all at once. He looked down at the boy, this child who'd been silent for so long, now finding his voice in the face of the very men who'd stolen it from him. "Samuel," John said softly, but the boy wasn't finished. "My real father," Samuel continued, tears streaming down his face now. "He made bad choices. He took money that wasn't his. And you killed him for it. I saw you. I remember." His voice broke, but didn't stop. "But this man, John, he didn't have to help us. He didn't have to take a bullet for my mama. He didn't have to let us stay here or teach me about horses or make us feel safe again. But he did. And that makes him more of a father than blood ever could." The silence that followed was absolute. Anna was crying openly now, her hand over her mouth, the gun forgotten at her side. John stood frozen, feeling the weight of Samuel's words settle over him like a cloak, heavy and warm and impossible to shrug off. The boy had just claimed him, had just chosen him, and in doing so, had given John something he didn't know he'd been searching for, a reason to be more than just a man waiting for his life to end. The leader's face had gone hard as stone. "That's real touching, boy. But it don't change nothing. We came for what's ours, and we're not leaving without it." His hand moved toward his gun. Everything that happened next seemed to occur both instantly and in slow motion. John raised his rifle, his body moving on instinct honed from years of survival. The leader's gun cleared leather. Anna screamed. Samuel stood his ground, small and brave and terrified. The first shot split the air. John's bullet caught the leader in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. The man's horse reared, and he tumbled backward, hitting the ground hard. The two younger gunmen went for their weapons, and John worked the lever on his Winchester, chambered another round, fired again. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near one of the horses. But it was enough to make them hesitate, to make them think twice about whether this was worth dying for. Anna fired the Colt, the recoil nearly knocking her backward. Her shot went nowhere near the men, but the sound of it, the fury and desperation behind it, made them understand they weren't just facing a rancher. They were facing a mother defending her child. "Next one won't miss," John shouted, his rifle trained on the closest rider. "You came looking for money, but all you're going to find here is graves. Is that worth it? Is $15,000 worth dying in the dirt on a stranger's land?" The two younger men looked at each other, then at their leader struggling to stand, blood spreading across his black shirt. They were calculating again, but the numbers had changed. 1 wounded, 2 against a determined man with a rifle and a desperate woman with a pistol, all standing between them and what they wanted. The math didn't work anymore. "This ain't over," one of them said, already turning his horse. "You hear me, Marston? This ain't over." "Then you know where to find me," John replied. They grabbed their wounded leader, hauled him onto his horse with rough efficiency, and rode away. Fast at first, then slower as distance made them brave again. John watched them go, his rifle still raised, until they disappeared into the gathering darkness. Only then did he lower the weapon. Only then did he realize he was shaking. Anna collapsed onto the porch steps, the gun clattering from her hands, and Samuel ran to her, throwing his small arms around her neck. They held each other, both crying now, making the sounds of people who'd been holding their breath underwater and finally broken the surface. John stood above them, his shoulders screaming with pain from the recoil, his hands still steady even though his insides felt like water. He'd just made enemies who wouldn't forget, who wouldn't forgive, who would come back eventually, probably with more men, probably with a plan. He'd just bought them time, that's all. Just bought them a few weeks or months before the reckoning came. But Samuel's words kept echoing in his mind. "He's my father now." The boy had spoken. After 6 months of silence, he'd found his voice, and he'd used it to claim John as his own. John looked down at them, mother and son, holding each other in the fading light, and felt something settle in his chest. Something that felt like purpose, like belonging, like the answer to a question he'd stopped asking years ago. He'd been alone for so long, had convinced himself that solitude was safer than connection, that walls were stronger than bridges. But now, standing on his porch with gunpowder, smoke still hanging in the air, and his heart still pounding, he understood something fundamental about what it meant to be alive. You couldn't protect yourself from loss by refusing to love. You could only protect yourself from regret by choosing to love anyway, despite the cost, despite the fear, despite knowing that everything you built could be torn down in an instant. Samuel had chosen him, had called him father, had given him a gift more precious than gold or land or safety. And John Marston, rancher and former drifter, man who'd lost his family and thought he'd lost his chance at redemption, made a choice of his own in that moment. He would be worthy of that title, whatever it took, whatever it cost, even if it meant standing against every gun in the territory. He reached down and helped Anna to her feet, then placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder, that small, bony shoulder that somehow carried more courage than most men twice his size. "Let's get inside," John said quietly. "We'll talk about what comes next." But what came next wasn't just strategy or survival or planning for the next attack. What came next was the slow, careful work of becoming a family, not through blood, but through choice. And sometimes, John was learning, choice was stronger than any bond nature could forge. Pa, watch this. The word hit John square in the chest, same as it did every time Samuel said it. He looked up from the fence post he was hammering to see the boy on Willow's back, riding bareback in the corral with his arms spread wide like wings. The mare moved slow and steady beneath him, patient as always, and Samuel's face was bright with joy, pure and unguarded, the kind of happiness that comes from forgetting, even for a moment, what fear feels like. 3 months had passed since the gunman came. 3 months since the shooting, since the blood in the dirt, since Samuel had found his voice and claimed John as his father. The men hadn't returned. Word had spread through the territory about what happened at the Marston Ranch, about the widow who wouldn't be moved, the boy who'd spoken after months of silence, and the rancher who'd stood against 3 armed men to protect what he'd decided was his. Some said the outlaws had given up, that they'd decided $15,000 wasn't worth dying for. Others whispered that the leader had died from his wound, and his men had scattered to the winds without him. John didn't know which story was true, and he'd stopped caring. All that mattered was the quiet that had settled over his land, a quiet filled with voices now, with morning conversations and evening laughter, with the sound of a boy learning to be a boy again. "That's real good, son," John called back, and the word son came easier now. Came natural, like it had always been waiting in his mouth for the right person to claim it. Samuel grinned and urged Willow into a gentle trot, his small body moving with the horse's rhythm. The boy had grown in these months, not just taller, though he had, but stronger somehow, more present, like he'd been living underwater and had finally broken the surface, gasping and grateful for every breath. John returned to his hammering, driving nails into fresh pine, mending the sections of fence that had rotted over the years of neglect. The ranch was coming back to life, piece by piece. New chickens in the coop, cattle in the pasture, bought with money he'd saved and never had reason to spend. Gardens planted behind the house where Anna worked every morning, her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the hard frontier earth. She was different too, softer somehow, though no less strong. The fear that had lived in her eyes had faded to caution, and caution had slowly given way to something that looked like peace. She smiled more, sang sometimes while she worked old hymns her mother had taught her, her voice carrying across the ranch like a prayer. John had asked her once, about a month after the gunman left, if she wanted to leave, if she wanted to go somewhere else, start fresh where no one knew her story. She'd looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "Why would I leave? I'm already home." And that had been that. "John," Anna's voice called from the house now, and he turned to see her standing on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Supper's ready." He waved acknowledgement and set down his hammer. Samuel had already dismounted and was leading Willow back to the barn, talking to the horse in that steady, gentle way he had, telling her about his day, about the rabbit he'd seen by the creek, about the clouds that looked like ships sailing across the sky. The boy talked all the time now, made up for those 6 months of silence, with a river of words that John never grew tired of hearing. Inside, the house smelled like cornbread and stew, like warmth and life and all the things John had forgotten a home could be. The table was set with 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 chairs pulled close. His daughter's room was Samuel's room now, the yellow flower quilt washed and mended, the space filled with a child's treasures, smooth stones from the creek, feathers collected on walks, a wooden horse John had carved on a quiet evening. They sat together, the 3 of them, and Anna said grace. Her prayers were simple and honest, thanking God for food and safety and the kindness of strangers who became family. John bowed his head and listened, feeling something in his chest that he'd almost forgotten how to name. Gratitude. Not for what he'd been given, but for what he'd been allowed to give. After supper, while Anna cleaned the dishes and hummed her hymns, John sat on the porch with Samuel beside him. The boy was reading from an old Bible, sounding out the words slowly, his finger tracing each line. John had been teaching him in the evenings, using the only book the ranch had, and Samuel took to learning like he'd been starving for it. "And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water," Samuel read, his voice careful and proud, "that bringeth forth his fruit in his season." He looked up at John. "What's that mean, Pa?" John thought for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Means that when you're planted in good soil, in a good place, you grow strong. You bear fruit. You become what you're meant to be." Samuel considered this, his young face serious. "Like me? Coming here was like being planted by water." "Yeah," John said quietly. "I suppose it was. For all of us." The boy smiled and went back to his reading, and John felt that warmth in his chest again, that sense of something taking root that couldn't be torn up by wind or drought or violence. Later that night, after Samuel was asleep and Anna had retired to her room, John sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold. He'd pulled out an old photograph from the drawer, the only one he had of his daughter, taken before his wife left, before everything fell apart. The girl in the picture was smiling, missing her front teeth, holding a doll John had bought her at the general store. He studied that photograph for a long time, feeling the old grief rise up like it always did, but softer now, less sharp. He'd failed that child. Failed to be the husband his wife needed, the father his daughter deserved. Had driven them away with his silence and his stubbornness, and his belief that providing was the same as loving. But Samuel had given him another chance. Anna had given him another chance. Not to replace what he'd lost. You couldn't replace people like they were broken tools. But to become something better than what he'd been. A soft knock on the doorframe made him look up. Anna stood there in her nightgown, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair loose around her face. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Just thinking." She moved into the kitchen and sat across from him, her eyes falling on the photograph. "Your daughter." "Yeah, Rebecca. She'd be 12 now. Living in Boston with her mother and her mother's new husband. Good man, from what I hear. Gives her things I never could." Anna reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm, steady. "You're a good man too, John Marston. Don't ever doubt that. I failed them. Maybe. Or maybe you just weren't ready yet. Maybe you had to lose everything before you could learn how to hold on to something." She squeezed his hand gently. "Samuel loves you. Not because you're perfect, but because you show up. Every day, you show up. You teach him and protect him and make him feel like he matters. That's what fatherhood is. Not some grand gesture. Just showing up again and again, even when it's hard." John looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something in her face he hadn't noticed before. A softness when she looked at him. A warmth that went beyond gratitude. "Anna," he started, but she shook her head. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that we're not staying because we're afraid to leave. We're staying because this is where we want to be. Because you made us feel like we belong somewhere again." She stood, still holding his hand. "And maybe you belong somewhere too now. With us." She left before he could respond, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor, her door closing with a quiet click. John sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after that, the photograph still in front of him, Anna's words settling over him like snow. Belonging. He'd spent so long believing he didn't deserve it, that he'd used up his chances and would spend the rest of his days alone as payment for his failures. But maybe that wasn't how it worked. Maybe grace wasn't something you earned. It was something you accepted when it appeared, unexpected and undeserved, in the form of a widow and a boy who needed you as much as you needed them. The next morning, John woke early and found Samuel already in the barn, brushing down Willow like he did every morning without being asked. The rancher stood in the doorway, watching the boy work, and felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest. "Morning, Pa," Samuel said without turning around. "Think we could ride out to the creek today? Maybe do some fishing." "Yeah," John said. "I think we could do that." They spent the day by the water, the three of them, John and Samuel with fishing lines, Anna sitting on a blanket with mending in her lap. The boy caught 2 fish, small but proud, and insisted on cooking them himself that night. They tasted like mud and triumph, and John told him they were the best fish he'd ever eaten. Samuel beamed. That night, as John was tucking the boy into bed, Samuel looked up at him with those 2 old eyes that were slowly learning to be young again. "Pa," he said quietly, "are you going to stay? Forever?" John felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, son. I'm going to stay. Even if those bad men come back. Even then. Even if it gets hard. Especially then." Samuel thought about this, then nodded, satisfied. "Okay. Good. Because I don't want to leave. I like it here. I like being your son." John had to look away for a moment, had to blink hard against the burning in his eyes. When he could speak again, his voice was rough. "I like being your pa." He kissed the boy's forehead, something that had felt strange at first, but now felt natural as breathing, and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Anna was waiting in the hallway, and when she saw his face, she smiled. A knowing smile. A gentle one. "He's lucky to have you," she whispered. "No," John said. "I'm the lucky one." Weeks turned into months, and the ranch continued its transformation from a place of ghosts into a place of life. The gardens grew thick with vegetables. The cattle multiplied. The fences stood straight and strong, mended by hands that had finally found purpose in the work. Samuel grew taller, stronger, his voice losing its hesitation. He learned to rope and ride, to mend leather and shoe horses, to read not just words but the sky and the land and the signs that told a cowboy when weather was coming or when trouble was near. Anna's smiles came easier. Her songs grew louder. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, John would catch her watching him with an expression that made his heart stumble in his chest. One evening, 6 months after the gunman came and went, John found her in the garden, harvesting tomatoes in the fading light. He stood at the fence, watching her work, gathering his courage. "Anna," he said finally, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, a tomato in each hand, her face curious. "Of course." "Would you? That is, I was wondering if—" He stopped, frustrated with himself, with how clumsy his words felt. "I'd like you to stay. Not as a guest. Not as someone I'm protecting. But as my wife. If you'd have me." The tomatoes fell from her hands, forgotten. She stared at him, her eyes wide, and for a terrible moment John thought he'd ruined everything. Thought he'd pushed too far, assumed too much, mistaken gratitude for something deeper. But then she was moving toward him, fast and graceful, and her arms were around his neck, and her face was pressed against his shoulder, and she was crying and laughing all at once. "Yes," she whispered against his shirt. "Yes, John. Yes." They were married a month later, in a small ceremony at the church in town. Samuel stood beside John, solemn and proud in his new shirt, holding the rings they'd picked out together. The boy had insisted on being part of it, had practiced his role for days, and when the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married, Samuel had spoken up clear and strong. "I do. And my pa does too." The congregation had laughed warm and gentle, and Anna had cried, and John had felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Joy, pure and simple and uncomplicated. They rode back to the ranch as a family, official now in the eyes of God and man, and when they crested the ridge and saw the house waiting below, their house, their home, John felt something settle in his soul that he'd been searching for his entire life. He'd been a drifter once, a failed husband, a father who'd lost his way, but now he was something different, something better. He was a man who'd chosen to stay, who'd chosen to fight for what mattered, who'd chosen again and again in 1,000 small moments to be worthy of the love he'd been given. That night, after the celebration, after Samuel had finally fallen asleep, exhausted and happy, John and Anna sat on the porch in the darkness. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving us a home, for giving Samuel a father, for giving me a second chance." "I'm the one who should be thanking you," John replied. "You both saved me. Gave me something to live for again. Something to be. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, crickets and wind, and the gentle movements of horses in the barn. The stars spread overhead like diamonds scattered on black velvet, endless and bright. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Anna asked quietly. "Those men. I don't know. Maybe. Probably. And if they do—" John tightened his arm around her. "Then we'll face them together. All three of us. Because that's what families do. They stand together, no matter what comes." Anna lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "I love you, John Marston." It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and the words hit him like a benediction. Like forgiveness for every mistake he'd ever made. "I love you too," he said, and meant it with everything he had. Inside the house, they could hear Samuel stirring, mumbling in his sleep. Words now instead of nightmares. Stories instead of screams. The boy was healing. They all were. And John understood, finally, what it meant to come home. Not to a place, but to a people. To a purpose. To the slow, patient work of building something that mattered. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of showing up when it would have been easier to run. The ranch spread out below them, dark and quiet and full of possibility. The fences he'd mended. The garden Anna had planted. The barn where Samuel brushed Willow every morning, talking to her like she was his best friend. This was legacy. This was redemption. Not in some grand moment of heroism, but in the ordinary accumulation of days lived with purpose and love. A boy who called him Pa. A woman who'd chosen him despite everything. A home that was finally, truly, a home. John Marston, rancher and father and husband, sat on his porch with his wife beside him and his son sleeping safe inside, and felt the weight of his past finally begin to lift. Some men spent their whole lives searching for meaning. He'd found his in the simple act of staying, of choosing again and again to be present for the people who needed him, of learning that family wasn't something you were born into, but something you built with your hands and your heart and your stubborn refusal to give up when things got hard. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust and growing things, and John closed his eyes and breathed it in. This was enough. This was everything. This was home.